Welcome to Scary Stories for a Rainy Night. If you enjoy what you hear tonight, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me bring you more of these spine-chilling stories. Thank you for being here, and now let's begin. I moved to Millfield Road on a Tuesday in late September when the leaves were just starting to turn, and the air had that crisp bite that promised winter wasn't far behind. The house was perfect for me, a small, two-bedroom bungalow with a decent-sized yard and windows that let in plenty of natural light. More importantly, it was all I could afford on my teacher's salary after my divorce. The neighborhood seemed quiet, the kind of place where people kept to themselves but would still wave if they saw you checking the mail. My next-door neighbor's house sat about 15 feet from mine, separated by a narrow strip of grass that neither of us bothered to maintain. It was an older colonial-style home, painted a faded yellow that had probably been cheerful once, but now looked more like old mustard. The shutters were dark green, and several were hanging crooked or missing slats entirely. The front porch sagged slightly, and weeds had taken over most of the flower beds. It wasn't the worst-looking house on the block, but it definitely wasn't winning any landscaping awards either. For the first few weeks, I barely noticed the place. I was too busy unpacking boxes, setting up my new classroom for the school year, and trying to establish some kind of routine in my new life as a single woman. I'd see lights on in the windows at night and occasionally catch glimpses of movement through the curtains, but I never actually laid eyes on whoever lived there. There was an old pickup truck in the driveway, covered in rust spots and what looked like years of accumulated grime, but I never saw anyone coming or going. The first time I really paid attention to my neighbor's house was on a Saturday morning in early October. I was outside raking leaves, enjoying the peaceful morning and the satisfying scratch of the rake against the ground when a smell hit me. It was faint at first, just an odd note in the crisp autumn air that made me wrinkle my nose and look around. I figured maybe someone was burning something they shouldn't be, or perhaps there was a dead animal somewhere nearby. You know how these things go in the suburbs. A raccoon gets hit by a car and crawls off to die under someone's deck. But as I continued working, the smells seemed to get stronger. It wasn't the clean scent of wood smoke or even the unpleasant but familiar odor of a small dead animal. This was something else entirely, something that made my stomach turn and my instincts scream that something was very, very wrong. It was sweet and rotten at the same time, with an underlying metallic note that reminded me of the time I'd cut my hand badly on a broken glass and hadn't cleaned it properly for hours. I found myself moving closer to the property line, following my nose like some kind of macabre bloodhound. The smell was definitely coming from my neighbor's house, or more specifically, from the direction of their backyard. I tried to peer over the 6-foot privacy fence that separated our properties, but I couldn't see much from ground level, just the tops of some overgrown bushes and what looked like the corner of a shed or outbuilding. That's when I heard the flies. If you've ever been near something that's been dead for a while, you know the sound I'm talking about. It's not just the occasional buzz of a few insects, it's a constant, angry humming, the sound of hundreds or maybe thousands of flies swarming over something that's attracting them in a very specific and disturbing way. The sound was coming from the same direction as the smell somewhere in my neighbor's backyard, and it was loud enough that I could hear it clearly over the ambient noise of the neighborhood. I stood there for a long moment, rake in hand, trying to process what I was experiencing. My rational mind was working overtime, trying to come up with innocent explanations. Maybe they had a compost pile that had gotten out of hand. Maybe they were amateur hunters who were processing deer or other game animals in their backyard. Maybe they had a large dog that had died and they were waiting for someone to come pick up the body. But deep down, in that primitive part of my brain that's kept humans alive for millions of years, I knew that none of those explanations felt right. The smell wasn't quite like rotting vegetables or even rotting meat in the normal sense. There was something about it that was almost familiar, but familiar in a way that made my skin crawl and my heart rate pick up. I finished my yard work as quickly as I could and went inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong next door. I tried to distract myself with household chores and lesson planning, but every time I went near a window that faced my neighbour's house, I found myself staring and trying to see some sign of what might be causing that awful smell. Over the next few days, I became increasingly aware of the odd rhythms of life next door. There were lights on at strange hours, 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes all night long. I'd see the glow through the curtains when I got up to use the bathroom or when I couldn't sleep and found myself wandering around my house. During the day, the house often looked completely dark and abandoned, as if whoever lived there was nocturnal by choice or necessity. The smell continued too, wafting over whenever the wind was blowing in the right direction. Some days it was barely noticeable, just a faint, unpleasant note that I might have dismissed if I hadn't already been paying attention. Other days, particularly when it was warm and humid, the odour was so strong that I couldn't open my windows on that side of the house. I started keeping them closed and running the air conditioning, even though the weather was perfect for natural ventilation. I began to pay attention to my neighbour's garbage pickup routine, thinking that might give me some clue about what was going on. Most of the houses on our street put their trash cans out on Tuesday night for Wednesday morning pickup, but my neighbour's routine was erratic and strange. Sometimes there would be 3 or 4 large garbage bags out on the curb, so full they were straining at the seams and leaking dark stains onto the pavement. Other weeks there would be nothing at all, as if no one was living there. The bags themselves looked wrong somehow. They were always black contractor bags, the heavy-duty kind that you use for yard waste or construction debris, and they were always tied with what looked like excessive amounts of rope or wire. Most people just twist the tops of their garbage bags and maybe tie them with the little plastic ties that come with the bags, but these looked like they'd been secured by someone who was really worried about the contents spilling out. One Wednesday morning, I was leaving early for a faculty meeting when I noticed that one of my neighbour's bags had split open during the night. The garbage truck hadn't come yet, and there was a dark, wet mess spreading across the sidewalk and into the street. I slowed down as I walked past, morbid curiosity getting the better of me, and I immediately wished I hadn't looked. Mixed in with what looked like normal household trash, old newspapers and food containers and the like, there were things that made no sense. Pieces of what looked like clothing, but clothing that was stained dark red and brown in ways that suggested they'd been soaked in something organic and left to dry. There were also shapes that I couldn't quite identify, wrapped in plastic bags that had torn open to reveal glimpses of something pale and mottled underneath. But it was the smell that really got to me. Up close, with the bag split open and its contents partially exposed to the air, that sweet, rotten, metallic odour was overwhelming. I actually gagged and had to step back, covering my nose and mouth with my hand. It wasn't just unpleasant, It was actively nauseating in a way that suggested my body knew exactly what it was smelling and was trying to protect me from it. I hurried past and drove to work, but I couldn't concentrate on the faculty meeting or my classes that day. My mind kept going back to what I'd seen and smelled, trying to make sense of it. By the time I drove home that afternoon, the garbage truck had come and gone, and the sidewalk had been hosed down, probably by whoever lived in the house. But there were still dark stains on the concrete that looked like they'd been scrubbed, but not completely removed. That night, I did something I'd never done before in my life. I called the police non-emergency line. The dispatcher was patient and professional, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice as I tried to explain my concerns. How do you tell someone that your neighbor's garbage smells wrong without sounding paranoid or crazy? How do you describe the feeling that something terrible is happening next door when you don't have any concrete evidence, just a collection of odd details and a growing sense of dread?
Has there been any actual criminal activity that you've witnessed? She asked. No, I had to admit. Not exactly, it's just that there are these smells, and the garbage looks strange and there are flies.
Smells and flies could be a lot of things, Mum. Do you think there might be a sanitation issue? You could call code enforcement if you're concerned about health violations. I thanked her and hung up, feeling foolish but not reassured. Code enforcement dealt with overgrown lawns and unpermitted additions, not with whatever was happening next door. And deep down, I knew that what I was dealing with was beyond the scope of municipal regulations. Over the next week, I found myself paying even closer attention to my neighbour's house, almost against my will. It was like picking at a scab. I knew it wasn't healthy, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. I started keeping a notebook, jotting down observations about lights, sounds, smells, and anything else that seemed relevant. Looking back, I realized this was probably when my casual concern started turning into genuine obsession. The pattern of activity next door was becoming clearer. During the day, especially during school hours when most people in the neighborhood were at work, the house was quiet and dark. But starting around sunset, things would begin to stir. I'd see lights come on in different rooms, always dim and usually filtered through heavy curtains or blinds. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement, shadows passing by windows, but I never got a clear look at whoever was inside. The most activity seemed to happen late at night, after most of the neighborhood had gone to bed. I'd hear car doors slamming softly, as if someone was trying to be quiet, but not entirely succeeding. There would be the sound of the front door opening and closing, sometimes multiple times in a single night. Occasionally I'd hear voices, always too muffled and distant to make out words, but there was something about the tone that suggested urgency or secrecy. And through it all, that smell persisted, growing stronger on warm days and when the wind was blowing from the east. I started sleeping with my bedroom window closed, even though it faced away from my neighbor's house, because the odor seemed to seep through the walls and infiltrate my dreams. It was around this time that I began to notice changes in the local animal population. The neighborhood had always had its share of stray cats, and I'd grown accustomed to seeing the same few individuals prowling around the garbage cans and sunning themselves on porches. But gradually I realized that I wasn't seeing them anymore. At first, I figured they'd just moved on to better hunting grounds or found homes with people who fed them regularly. But then I noticed that even the regular pets in the neighborhood seemed to avoid my street entirely. Dogs being walked, would strain against their leashes when their owners tried to lead them past my neighbour's house, and I saw more than one person cross to the other side of the street rather than deal with their pet's sudden reluctance to continue forward. The mail carrier started acting strangely too. I'd always exchanged pleasantries with Janet, the postal worker, who'd been delivering to our route for years, but she began to seem nervous and hurried when she reached our section of the street. She'd practically jog from my mailbox to my neighbour's and then away again, as if she couldn't wait to be somewhere else. One afternoon in late October, I decided to approach Janet directly. I timed it so I'd be checking my mail when she arrived, and I could see the tension in her shoulders as she worked her way down our street. "Hey, Janet," I called out as she reached my mailbox. "How's your day going?" She glanced toward my neighbour's house and then back at me, lowering her voice. "You know, I've been doing this route for 8 years, and I've never had a house that bothered me like that one does." She nodded toward the yellow Colonial. "There's something not right about it." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea. Janet shifted her mailbag and looked around nervously. "Well, for one thing, I never see anyone. But that's not unusual. Lots of people aren't home during the day. It's more the feel of the place, you know? And the smell." She wrinkled her nose. "Some days it's so bad I have to hold my breath just to get the mail in the slot." "Have you ever seen who lives there?"
"Just once," she said, and something in her tone made me pay closer attention. "About a month ago, I was running late because of a problem with the truck, so it was almost dark when I got to this street. The porch light was on, and as I was walking up the steps, the front door opened." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "And?" I prompted.
It was a man, probably in his 50s, kind of thin and pale. But what struck me was how he looked at me like he was sizing me up or something. And his hands. She shuddered. His hands were stained dark, like he'd been working with motor oil or paint. But it didn't look like either of those things. It looked more like dried blood.
A chill ran down my spine. "What did he say to you?"
That's the thing. He didn't say anything at first. Just stared at me for what felt like forever. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made me want to run. Finally, he said, "Thank you for the delivery," in this soft voice. But there was something about the way he said it that made my skin crawl.
Janet finished distributing the mail to the remaining boxes on our side of the street, clearly eager to move on. "I've been thinking about requesting a route change," she admitted. "I know that sounds crazy, but I dread coming to this street now."
After she left, I stood in my driveway for a long time, staring at my neighbour's house. The afternoon sun was hitting the windows at an angle that made it impossible to see inside, but I had the distinct feeling that someone was watching me from behind those curtains. That evening I made a decision that I knew was probably unwise but felt necessary. I was going to find out what was in my neighbour's backyard. I waited until well after midnight, when the house next door had been dark and quiet for several hours. I dressed in dark clothing and grabbed a small flashlight, the kind with a red filter that hunters use so they don't spook game. My plan was simple: climb the fence, take a quick look around, and get out. I told myself I was just being a concerned citizen, looking out for the safety of the neighbourhood. The fence between our properties was old but sturdy, made of pressure-treated lumber that had weathered to a silvery grey. I'd never been much of an athlete, but adrenaline and determination helped me pull myself up and over without making too much noise. I dropped down into my neighbour's backyard and immediately wished I hadn't. The smell hit me like a physical blow, so intense that I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from retching. It was the same odour I'd been detecting for weeks, but concentrated to an almost unbearable degree. My eyes watered and my throat burned, and I had to take several shallow breaths through my mouth before I could function normally. The backyard was larger than mine, maybe 40 by 60 feet, but it was hard to get a sense of the layout in the darkness. I could make out the shapes of several outbuildings, including what looked like a large shed or workshop near the back of the property. There were also several areas where the ground looked disturbed, as if someone had been digging recently. I clicked on my flashlight, keeping the beam low, and pointed at the ground. The grass was patchy and unhealthy looking, with several areas that were completely bare dirt. As I moved the light around, I began to notice things scattered in the yard that made my blood run cold. There were bones. Not the kind you'd expect to find in a suburban backyard, like the remains of barbecued chicken or steak dinners. These were larger, and they had been picked clean by scavengers or insects. Some of them looked disturbingly familiar in their proportions, though I tried not to let my mind go down that particular path. Near the shed, I found what appeared to be a burn pit. It was a circular area about 6 feet across where the ground was charred black and littered with ash and partially burned debris. I knelt down and examined it more closely, using a stick to poke through the remains. Most of it was too damaged to identify, but I found fragments of what looked like fabric and several items that might have been personal belongings. A melted plastic comb, part of a leather wallet, and something that looked like it might have been jewellery. The shed itself was padlocked, but one of the windows was partially open. I knew I was already in way over my head, but I couldn't resist taking a look inside. I stood on an overturned bucket and peered through the gap in the window. What I saw in that shed will haunt me for the rest of my life. The interior was lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows on walls that were lined with what looked like tools. But these weren't gardening tools or normal workshop equipment. They were surgical instruments, knives of various sizes, and devices I couldn't identify, but that filled me with a deep, instinctive terror. There were several tables in the center of the space, made of stainless steel and equipped with drainage channels around the edges. The surfaces were stained dark brown and black, and there were buckets positioned underneath to catch whatever might drip down. Along one wall there were shelves holding glass jars filled with things I didn't want to examine too closely. But it was what I saw hanging from hooks along the back wall that made me nearly lose my balance and fall off the bucket. They looked like cuts of meat, but the shapes were wrong, the proportions too familiar. And mixed in with them were items of clothing, arranged almost like trophies. I backed away from the window so quickly that I knocked over the bucket, and the clatter seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. I froze, listening for any sign that I'd been heard, but the house remained dark and silent. Still, I knew I needed to get out of there immediately.
As I made my way back toward the fence, I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. There were several areas in the yard where the ground looked freshly turned, as if holes had been dug and then filled in again. The dirt was darker and looser than the surrounding soil, and in some places I could see that grass had been hastily replanted in an attempt to camouflage the disturbance.
I climbed back over the fence with a lot less care for stealth than I'd used on the way in. All I wanted was to get back to my house, lock all the doors, and figure out what to do with what I'd discovered. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely work the key in my back door lock, and once I was inside, I immediately went to every window and door to make sure they were secure. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I sat in my kitchen with all the lights on, trying to process what I'd seen and decide on my next move. I knew I had to call the police, but I also knew that what I'd done was technically trespassing. Would they even believe me? And what if my neighbor realized that someone had been in his yard?
As dawn broke, I made my decision. I called the police emergency line. 911, what's your emergency?
I need to report what I think might be a crime, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I believe my neighbor may be killing people. The dispatcher's tone became more focused. Ma'am, I need you to tell me exactly what you've seen or heard that makes you believe this. I took a deep breath and began to explain everything. The smells, the strange garbage, the bones in the yard, and what I'd seen in the shed. The dispatcher asked for my address and told me that officers would be there within 10 minutes. As I waited, I kept watch from my front window. The neighbor's house remained quiet and dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone inside knew exactly what was coming. The police arrived in 2 unmarked cars, which I appreciated since I was hoping to avoid drawing attention from the entire neighborhood. 3 officers approached my front door, 2 in plain clothes and 1 in uniform. The lead detective introduced herself as Detective Maria Santos, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "I understand you have some concerns about your neighbor. Can you walk us through what you've observed?" I invited them into my living room and spent the next 20 minutes recounting everything I'd noticed over the past several weeks. Detective Santos took detailed notes, while the other 2 officers, Detective Chen and Officer Rodriguez, asked follow-up questions about timing, specific details, and my own background. I could tell they were trying to assess whether I was a credible witness or just a paranoid neighbor with an overactive imagination. "Now, you mentioned that you went onto the property last night," Detective Santos said, her tone carefully neutral. "I have to advise you that trespassing is a crime, though under the circumstances I understand why you felt compelled to investigate." "I know it was wrong," I said, "but I was so worried that someone might be in danger. What I saw in that shed, Detective, it wasn't normal. It looked like a place where someone would butcher animals, except..."
"Except you don't think it was animals?" Detective Chen finished for me. I nodded. "The bones in the yard, the smell, the way he looked at the mail carrier. It all adds up to something terrible." Detective Santos closed her notebook and exchanged glances with her colleagues. "Mrs. Patterson, we're going to need to verify some of what you've told us. We'll start by running a background check on the property owner and seeing if we can get a warrant to search the premises. In the meantime, I want you to stay away from that house and avoid any contact with your neighbor if possible."
What if he knows I was there? What if he saw me? "We'll increase patrols in this area," Officer Rodriguez assured me. "And here's my direct number. If you see or hear anything else unusual, call immediately. Don't wait. Don't second-guess yourself."
After the police left, I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. Every sound from next door made me jump. Every shadow moving past a window made my heart race. I called in sick to work, claiming a stomach bug, which wasn't entirely untrue since the stress had left me nauseous and shaky.
Around noon, I saw a car pull into my neighbour's driveway. It was a different vehicle than the usual pickup truck, a dark sedan that looked like it might be a rental. I watched from behind my curtains as a man got out and approached the front door. He was tall and thin, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face, but there was something familiar about his movements. The front door opened before he could knock, and I caught a glimpse of the person who answered. It was definitely a man, probably in his 50s as the male carrier had described, but I was too far away to make out his features clearly. The two men spoke briefly on the porch, their conversation animated but too quiet for me to overhear. Then they both went inside and the house returned to its usual stillness. The sedan stayed in the driveway for about 3 hours. When the visitor finally emerged, he was carrying what looked like a large duffel bag that appeared to be quite heavy based on how he was handling it. He loaded it into his trunk, said something to my neighbour, who had followed him outside, and then drove away. I immediately called Detective Santos and reported what I'd seen. She thanked me for the information and told me that they were still working on obtaining a search warrant, but that these things took time. She also mentioned that they'd run a preliminary background check on the property owner, a man named Harold Vance, and found some interesting information that they were following up on. What kind of information? I asked. I can't go into details right now, but let's just say Mr. Vance has had some legal troubles in the past. Nothing that would automatically justify a search warrant, but enough to make us take your concerns seriously. That evening, I decided I couldn't stay in my house any longer. The stress was eating at me, and every time I looked out a window that faced my neighbour's property, I felt a chill run down my spine. I packed a bag and drove to my sister's house across town, telling her that I was having some work done and needed a place to stay for a few days. Sarah had always been the practical one in our family, the kind of person who approached problems with logic and common sense rather than emotion. When I finally broke down and told her what was happening, she listened without judgment but with obvious concern. "Emma, this sounds absolutely terrifying," she said. "But are you sure you're not letting your imagination run away with you? I mean, bad smells and strange garbage could have a lot of explanations." "I know how it sounds," I replied. "But you didn't see what I saw in that shed. Those weren't gardening tools, Sarah. They were instruments designed to cut up something, and based on the size and shape of some of those bones in the yard, I don't think it was deer or cattle." She was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd told her. "Okay, let's say you're right, and this Harold person is doing something horrible. Why hasn't anyone else noticed? Why haven't other neighbours complained?"
It was a good question, and one I'd been asking myself. I think part of it is the location of my house. I'm the closest neighbour, and my bedroom window faces directly toward his backyard. Most of the other houses are either too far away or positioned so they wouldn't notice the smells or sounds. Plus, he seems to be very careful about when he does whatever it is he's doing. It's always late at night or early in the morning when most people are asleep.
Sarah made up the guest room for me and insisted that I try to get some rest. She was right that I needed sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hanging shapes in the shed or thought about the dark stains on those steel tables. I finally gave up around 3 in the morning and went to sit on Sarah's front porch, staring up at the stars and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. My phone rang at 6:30 the next morning. It was Detective Santos. Mrs. Patterson, I need you to listen carefully. We obtained a search warrant for your neighbour's property, and we executed it about an hour ago. What we found confirms your suspicions and then some. Harold Vance is in custody, and we're treating this as a homicide investigation.
The relief was so overwhelming that I actually started crying. So I wasn't crazy. There really was something wrong? You were absolutely right to call us, Detective Santos said firmly. Your observations and willingness to come forward may have saved lives. We found evidence suggesting that Mr. Vance has been killing people and disposing of their remains on his property for several months, possibly longer. How many people?
There was a pause. We're still processing the scene, but based on what we've found so far, we believe there may be as many as 6 victims. We're bringing in forensic anthropologists and cadaver dogs to help with the recovery and identification process. The detective explained that they'd also found evidence linking Vance to several missing persons cases in the area, people who had disappeared over the past year without a trace. The shed I'd peered into had indeed been used as a makeshift butcher shop, and the burial sites in the backyard contained human remains in various stages of decomposition. What about that man who visited yesterday? The one with the duffel bag? We're looking into that. We believe Vance may have been working with accomplices, or at least selling some of what he was doing to other people. The investigation is ongoing, but you don't need to worry about your safety anymore. Vance isn't getting out of jail anytime soon. I stayed at Sarah's house for another week, not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't ready to face the media circus that had erupted on Millfield Road. News vans lined the street, reporters knocked on doors asking for interviews, and curious onlookers drove by slowly, trying to get a glimpse of what they were already calling the House of Horrors. When I finally returned home, the yellow colonial next door was empty and sealed with police tape. A professional cleaning crew had been working for days to remove the contaminated soil from the backyard, and I could see that they'd also removed the shed entirely. The smell was gone, replaced by the sharp chemical odor of industrial disinfectant, but somehow that wasn't much of an improvement. The story made national news when more details emerged about Harold Vance's crimes. It turned out that he'd been luring victims through online classified ads, pretending to sell furniture or offer handyman services. When people came to his house to look at the items or discuss the work, he would overpower them and kill them. The forensic evidence suggested that he'd been dismembering the bodies and disposing of parts through various means, including burning, burial, and possibly selling human remains to people involved in occult activities. Detective Santos called me several times over the following weeks to update me on the investigation and to thank me again for coming forward. She told me that without my observations and willingness to report what I'd seen, they might never have discovered what was happening. Vance had been extremely careful to avoid detection, and it was only the combination of bad luck with his garbage bags and my particular vantage point that had exposed his crimes. "You should be proud of yourself," she said during one of our conversations. "I know it took courage to make that first call, especially when you weren't sure anyone would believe you. A lot of people would have convinced themselves they were imagining things or that it wasn't their responsibility to get involved." The trial took place 8 months later. Vance pleaded guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole. I attended the sentencing hearing partly to get some sense of closure, but mainly to see the faces of the victims' families. They deserved to know that someone had cared enough to speak up, even when it meant putting themselves at risk. Harold Vance never looked at me during the proceedings, but I studied his face carefully, trying to understand how someone could do the things he'd done while living a seemingly normal life in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He was exactly as the mail carrier had described him, thin and pale, with dark stains under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing had been able to remove. But what struck me most was how ordinary he appeared, how easily he could have been mistaken for any middle-aged man you might encounter at the grocery store or gas station. The house next door remained empty for over a year. The bank that had foreclosed on the property after Vance's arrest had trouble finding buyers, which wasn't surprising given the notoriety of what had happened there. Eventually, a demolition company tore down the yellow colonial and removed every trace of the foundation. The lot was replanted with grass and put up for sale as vacant land, though I noticed that the for sale sign stayed up for a very long time. I still live on Millfield Road, though I've made some changes to my daily routine. I installed security cameras around my property, not because I'm afraid of another Harold Vance moving in next door, but because the experience taught me the importance of paying attention to what's happening around me. I also got to know my other neighbors much better, and we've established an informal network of people who keep an eye out for each other. The empty lot next to my house has finally been sold, and construction on a new home is supposed to begin next month. The buyers are a young couple with 2 small children, the kind of family that will bring life and normalcy back to a space that held so much darkness. I'm looking forward to having neighbors again, to hearing the sounds of children playing in the backyard instead of flies buzzing over unthinkable horrors. But I'll never forget the lessons I learned during those terrible weeks in October. I'll never again dismiss a bad smell as probably nothing, or convince myself that something disturbing is none of my business. I learned that evil can hide behind the most mundane facades, and that sometimes the difference between life and death is whether someone cares enough to pay attention and speak up. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I'm more cautious about people I don't know, more aware of my surroundings, more willing to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. But I'm also more connected to my community, more invested in the well-being of the people around me, and more confident in my ability to handle difficult situations. Sometimes late at night, when I'm lying in bed listening to the familiar sounds of my neighborhood settling into sleep, I think about those 6 people who didn't make it home to their families. I think about how their disappearances might have remained unsolved forever if I hadn't been in the right place at the right time, with the right combination of curiosity and courage. It's a heavy responsibility, knowing that my actions made the difference between justice and impunity, between closure and eternal wondering for the families left behind.
I also think about all the Harold Vances who might still be out there, hiding in plain sight in quiet neighborhoods just like mine. The thought is terrifying, but it's also motivating. If there's one thing I learned from this experience, it's that ordinary people have more power than they realize to protect each other and fight back against the darkness that sometimes creeps into our communities.
The smell is gone now, replaced by the clean scent of new grass and the promise of fresh beginnings. But I'll never forget what it taught me about the importance of paying attention, speaking up, and refusing to look the other way when something doesn't feel right. Because sometimes that instinct to investigate a strange smell or report suspicious behavior isn't paranoia or nosiness. Sometimes it's the difference between life and death. The impact of what happened on Millfield Road extended far beyond my own experience. In the months following Harold Vance's arrest, I received dozens of calls and letters from people across the country who had similar stories to share. Some had ignored their instincts about strange neighbours and lived to regret it. Others had spoken up about suspicious activity, only to be dismissed by authorities who didn't take their concerns seriously. One letter that particularly stuck with me came from a woman in Oregon named Margaret Chen. She wrote that she'd been smelling something awful coming from her neighbour's apartment for weeks, but when she complained to the building manager, she was told it was probably just cooking odours from unfamiliar ethnic foods. It wasn't until another tenant found a body in the building's dumpster that anyone realised Margaret's instincts had been right all along. Her neighbour had been killing and dismembering prostitutes in his unit, disposing of the remains piece by piece in the building's trash system. Another correspondent, a man from Florida, told me about his experience with a neighbour who kept odd hours and had visitors at all times of night. The man said he'd considered calling police several times, but always talked himself out of it because he didn't want to seem like he was profiling someone based on their appearance or lifestyle. It wasn't until DEA agents raided the house and found a major drug manufacturing operation that he realized his suspicions had been justified. The chemicals being used in the process had been slowly poisoning everyone in the neighborhood, causing headaches, respiratory problems, and other health issues that residents had attributed to seasonal allergies or stress. These stories reinforced something Detective Santos had told me during one of our follow-up conversations. She said that in her 15 years of law enforcement, she'd seen countless cases that could have been solved much sooner if people had been willing to report their suspicions. The problem, she explained, wasn't that people didn't notice strange behavior or concerning signs. The problem was that they convinced themselves it wasn't their business, or they worried about being wrong and looking foolish.
People have this idea that if something really serious was happening, it would be obvious, she said. They think there would be screaming or visible violence or some other clear indication of criminal activity, but the truth is, most predators are very good at hiding what they do. They choose victims who won't be missed immediately. They work at times when neighbours are sleeping or away, and they've learned how to minimize the evidence that might give them away.
She went on to explain that Harold Vance was actually fairly typical of serial killers who operate from residential properties. He'd chosen his victims carefully, targeting people who were socially isolated or who wouldn't be missed right away. He'd soundproofed his shed to muffle any noise, and he'd developed a system for disposing of evidence that had worked successfully for months before I started paying attention. What made the difference in this case, Detective Santos told me, was that you didn't dismiss your instincts. You noticed the smell, you noticed the strange garbage, you noticed the behavioral patterns, and instead of convincing yourself it was nothing, you kept investigating until you had enough information to act on. The detective also shared some statistics that were both reassuring and disturbing. She said that according to FBI data, there are probably fewer than 50 active serial killers in the United States at any given time, which meant the chances of having one as a neighbor were extremely small. However, she also pointed out that those 50 people were responsible for hundreds of deaths each year, and that many of them operated successfully for years before being caught. The average serial killer claims 17 victims before being apprehended, she said. Harold Vance was at 6 when you stopped him. That means your actions probably saved at least 11 lives, possibly more. It was a sobering thought, and one that I carried with me as I tried to process the aftermath of the experience. I'd never thought of myself as someone who could make that kind of difference in the world. I was just a third-grade teacher who happened to live next door to a monster and happened to pay attention when things didn't seem right. The media attention was overwhelming at first. Reporters wanted to interview me about the experience, to hear firsthand how I'd uncovered the crimes and what advice I had for other people who might find themselves in similar situations. I agreed to a few interviews, mainly because Detective Santos thought it might encourage other people to report suspicious activity, but I found the process emotionally draining. The questions were always the same. How did I know something was wrong? Wasn't I afraid of confronting a dangerous person? What would I say to people who were experiencing something similar? Did I have any regrets about getting involved? That last question was the hardest to answer honestly. Of course I had regrets. I regretted waiting so long to call the police. I regretted not documenting more of what I'd observed in those early weeks. I regretted the sleepless nights and the constant anxiety that had consumed my life for months after Vance's arrest. But I never regretted making that first phone call, even though it had turned my quiet suburban life upside down. One interview request that I couldn't refuse came from the producer of a true crime podcast called Voices for the Voiceless. The show focused on cases where ordinary citizens had played crucial roles in solving crimes or bringing criminals to justice. The producer, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, approached the story with sensitivity and intelligence, focusing not just on the sensational aspects of the crimes, but on the broader implications for community safety and civic responsibility. During our conversation, Jennifer asked me something that no other interviewer had thought to explore. She wanted to know how the experience had changed my relationship with my community and my understanding of what it meant to be a good neighbor. I think before this happened, I had a very passive view of neighborhood life, I told her. I thought being a good neighbor meant keeping my property neat, not playing music too loud, and maybe bringing in someone's packages if they weren't home. I never considered that it might also mean paying attention to what was happening around me and being willing to speak up when something seemed wrong. Jennifer pointed out that my willingness to get involved had required a certain amount of courage, especially given that I was a single woman living alone. She asked whether I'd ever worried about retaliation from Vance or his associates, particularly during those weeks when the investigation was ongoing and he was still free. Absolutely, I admitted. There were nights when I barely slept because I was convinced he knew I'd been watching him. Every sound outside made me jump, and I started parking my car in different places so he couldn't track my movements as easily. But I also knew that if I didn't act on what I'd seen, more people were going to die. That knowledge made it impossible to just ignore the situation and hope someone else would handle it. The podcast episode aired about 6 months after Vance's sentencing, and the response was overwhelming. I received hundreds of emails from listeners who shared their own stories of suspicious neighbors, strange smells, and ignored instincts. Some had happy endings where quick thinking or decisive action had prevented tragedies. Others were more disturbing, tales of opportunities missed and warning signs overlooked until it was too late. One email that particularly moved me came from a man whose sister had been murdered by a neighbor several years earlier. He wrote that the family had always wondered whether someone might have noticed something and failed to report it, leaving them to struggle with questions that would never be answered. Reading about my experience had given him some peace, he said, because it showed that some people do pay attention and are willing to take risks to protect others. Another correspondent was a police officer from Michigan who thanked me for encouraging citizens to trust their instincts and report suspicious activity. He explained that many crimes go unsolved not because of lack of evidence, but because witnesses and neighbors fail to come forward with information they think might be irrelevant or insignificant. People see things, they hear things, they notice patterns, he wrote, but they convince themselves it's not important enough to bother the police with. What they don't realize is that their minor observation might be the piece of the puzzle that helps us solve a case or prevent a crime. As the first anniversary of Vance's arrest approached, I found myself reflecting on how the experience had changed, not just my own life, but the entire dynamic of our neighborhood. The vacant lot where his house had stood was finally showing signs of new construction, with survey stakes and building permits posted along the property line. The young family who'd bought the land had introduced themselves to me several months earlier, and we'd had a long conversation about the history of the site and their plans for the new house. They were remarkably unfazed by what had happened there. The husband, a software engineer named David, told me that they'd gotten the land at a significant discount because of its history, but that they saw it as an opportunity to create something positive from a place that had held so much darkness. "We're planning to build a house that's completely open to the neighborhood," he said. "Big windows, a front porch where people can see us and we can see them, a backyard that's designed for kids to play in safely. We want to make sure this corner of the street feels welcoming and normal again." His wife, Linda, was a nurse who worked at the Children's Hospital downtown. She mentioned that they'd already started a neighborhood watch group and were planning to organize regular community events to help people get to know each other better. "What happened here was horrible," she said, "but it doesn't have to define this place forever. We can choose to build something better in its place, something that honors the memory of the people who died by making sure our community is safer and more connected." Their optimism was infectious, and I found myself getting involved in the neighborhood watch and community organizing efforts in ways I never would have before my experience with Harold Vance. We started holding monthly meetings where residents could share concerns, discuss safety issues, and get to know each other beyond the casual wave-as-you-check the mailbox level that had characterized most of our previous interactions. One of the most valuable outcomes of these gatherings was the creation of a communication network that allowed us to quickly share information about suspicious activity or safety concerns. We set up a group text chain and an email list that residents could use to alert each other about anything from package thieves to unusual visitors to strange smells or sounds. The system proved its worth just a few months after we established it, when Mrs. Rodriguez from 3 houses down noticed a van parked on our street for several consecutive nights, with different people going in and out at odd hours. Instead of ignoring it or convincing herself it was probably nothing, she sent a message to the group, and several other residents confirmed they'd noticed the same activity. It turned out the van was being used as a mobile drug lab, and the people Mrs. Rodriguez had seen were customers coming to buy methamphetamines and other illegal substances. The police were able to arrest the operators and shut down the operation before it became established in our neighborhood, preventing the kind of long-term problems that could have affected property values and community safety for years. This is exactly what community policing should look like, Officer Martinez, our neighborhood liaison, told us after the arrests. You're not being asked to confront dangerous people or to investigate crimes yourselves. You're just being asked to pay attention and to communicate with each other and with us when something doesn't seem right. It's a simple concept, but it's incredibly effective when people are willing to participate. The success of our Neighborhood Watch program attracted attention from other communities dealing with similar issues. I was invited to speak at several community meetings and safety seminars, sharing my story and encouraging other residents to trust their instincts and look out for each other. These speaking engagements were emotionally challenging at first, requiring me to relive the most frightening period of my life in front of strangers who often had their own traumatic experiences to share. But they also became a source of healing and purpose, helping me transform what could have remained a purely negative experience into something that might prevent others from going through similar ordeals. At one particularly memorable event in a neighboring city, I met a woman whose teenage daughter had been abducted from a shopping mall parking lot 3 years earlier. The girl had never been found, and the family had been living with the uncertainty and grief ever since. The mother, whose name was Carol, approached me after my presentation with tears in her eyes. "I keep thinking about what you said about paying attention to small details and trusting your instincts," she said. "There was a man at the mall that day who was acting strangely, following my daughter and her friends around, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I didn't want to embarrass her by making a scene or calling security over what might have been nothing." She paused, struggling to continue. "I'll never know if speaking up that day would have made a difference. Maybe that man wasn't connected to what happened to Sarah at all. But maybe he was. And maybe if I'd trusted my instincts instead of worrying about looking foolish, my daughter would still be here." Carol's story was a stark reminder of the stakes involved in these situations. It's easy to second-guess yourself when you notice something that seems off, but can't quite put your finger on what's wrong. It's natural to worry about overreacting or causing unnecessary alarm. But the cost of being wrong about a potentially dangerous situation is so much higher than the cost of being wrong about a harmless one. After that conversation with Carol, I started incorporating her perspective into my presentations. I would tell audiences that while false alarms and mistaken suspicions can be embarrassing or inconvenient, they're infinitely preferable to the alternative of ignoring genuine warning signs until it's too late to act.
The worst thing that happens if you're wrong about a suspicious situation is that you might feel silly for a few days, I would say. But the worst thing that happens if you're right and you don't act is that someone dies. When you put it in those terms, the choice becomes pretty clear.
This message seemed to resonate with people, and I started receiving feedback from audience members who had been inspired to report concerns they might otherwise have dismissed. A man in Ohio called to tell me that my presentation had motivated him to contact police about a neighbour who had been burning things in his backyard at odd hours. It turned out the neighbour was destroying evidence of insurance fraud, and the man's report led to an investigation that recovered thousands of dollars in stolen property. A woman in Texas wrote to say that after hearing my story, she'd decided to trust her instincts about a co-worker whose behaviour had been making her uncomfortable. She reported the situation to Human Resources, and the subsequent investigation revealed that the man had been stalking several female employees and had a history of workplace violence at previous jobs. These success stories were gratifying, but they also carried a weight of responsibility that I sometimes found overwhelming. Knowing that people were making potentially life-changing decisions based on my experiences and advice was both humbling and terrifying. I started working with a therapist to process not just the trauma of my original experience with Harold Vance, but also the secondary stress of carrying other people's stories and fears. Dr. Williams, my therapist, helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a form of survivor's guilt mixed with what she called helper's syndrome. She explained that people who go through traumatic experiences often feel compelled to help others avoid similar situations, but that this impulse can become consuming if not managed carefully. "You saved lives by speaking up about Harold Vance," she told me during one of our sessions. "That's an incredible accomplishment, and you should be proud of it. But you can't save everyone, and you can't prevent every tragedy. Your role is to share your experience and encourage people to trust their instincts, not to carry the weight of every decision they make based on that advice." Her guidance was invaluable in helping me find a balance between using my experience to help others and maintaining my own emotional well-being. I learned to set boundaries around my involvement in community safety efforts and to recognize when I was taking on too much responsibility for outcomes beyond my control. The second anniversary of Harold Vance's crimes brought unexpected closure to one aspect of the case that had always bothered me. Detective Santos called to tell me that they'd finally identified the man who had visited Vance's house with the duffel bag on the day before the arrest. His name was Marcus Webb, and he'd been running what authorities described as a body broker operation, selling human remains to medical schools, research facilities, and private collectors who weren't asking too many questions about where the materials came from. Webb had been arrested in Nevada on unrelated charges, and when investigators searched his property, they found evidence linking him to Harold Vance and at least a dozen other people across the country who were involved in similar activities. The network was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized, with participants in multiple states and a client base that included some shocking high-profile individuals. "We might never have uncovered this whole operation if you hadn't made that initial report," Detective Santos told me. Webb and his associates had been operating for years, and they were very good at covering their tracks. Your observations about that visitor and the duffel bag gave us the lead we needed to start pulling apart the entire network. The revelation that Harold Vance had been part of a larger criminal enterprise was disturbing, but it also provided some validation for the instincts that had driven me to investigate in the first place. It hadn't just been random violence or the actions of a single disturbed individual. It had been organized crime, and my decision to pay attention and report what I'd seen had helped expose something much bigger than anyone had imagined. As I write this, 3 years have passed since that first morning, when I noticed the strange smell coming from my neighbor's yard. The new house on the lot next door is nearly complete, and David and Linda's 2 children have already become fixtures in the neighborhood, riding their bikes up and down the street and playing in yards where other kids are welcome to join them. The community we've built here is stronger and more connected than anything that existed before Harold Vance's crimes brought us together in shared concern for our safety. We know each other's names and schedules, we look out for each other's properties when people are away, and we've created systems for sharing information and addressing problems before they become crises. But perhaps most importantly, we've learned to trust our instincts and to value the kind of attention and awareness that can make the difference between safety and danger. We've learned that being a good neighbor isn't just about maintaining your property and keeping your noise down. It's about caring enough to pay attention to what's happening around you and being willing to act when something doesn't seem right. The smell is gone, replaced by the fresh scent of new grass and blooming flowers from Linda's garden. The sounds of children playing have replaced the ominous buzzing of flies and the mysterious late-night activities that once made me lock my doors and close my windows in fear. But I'll never forget what that smell taught me about the importance of paying attention, trusting your instincts, and being willing to speak up when something doesn't feel right. Because sometimes the willingness to investigate a strange odor or report suspicious behavior isn't paranoia or nosiness. Sometimes it's the difference between life and death, and sometimes it's the beginning of building the kind of community where people look out for each other, where children can play safely in their yards, and where evil cannot hide behind the facade of suburban normalcy. The House of Horrors is gone, but the lessons it taught us remain. And in some small way that makes Harold Vance's victims' deaths mean something more than just senseless tragedy. It makes them a catalyst for change, a reminder of our responsibility to each other, and a testament to the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary differences in their communities. The lessons I learned from living next to Harold Vance extend far beyond personal safety and community awareness. They fundamentally changed how I approach my role as an educator and my responsibility to the children in my care. When I returned to teaching after taking a leave of absence during the investigation and trial, I found myself viewing my students through a different lens, more attuned to signs that something might be wrong in their home lives. Children, I realized, are often the most vulnerable members of our community, and they're also the least equipped to recognize or report dangerous situations. They depend on the adults around them to notice when something isn't right and to take action to protect them. My experience with Harold Vance had taught me that predators often hide in plain sight, presenting themselves as ordinary, trustworthy members of the community while engaging in horrific activities behind closed doors. I started paying closer attention to changes in my students' behavior, unexplained injuries, and stories that didn't quite add up. I refreshed my training on recognizing signs of abuse and neglect, and I made sure I understood the proper procedures for reporting concerns to Child Protective Services. Most importantly, I tried to create an environment in my classroom where children felt safe talking about things that were bothering them or frightening them at home. The first time I had to make a report based on what I'd observed, my hands were shaking as I dialed the number for social services. 8-year-old Marcus had been coming to school with bruises that he couldn't adequately explain, and he'd started having nightmares during our quiet reading time. His behavior had changed from outgoing and cheerful to withdrawn and anxious, and he'd begun hoarding food from lunch, stuffing crackers and fruit into his backpack, as if he wasn't sure when he'd eat again. When I spoke with the social worker, I found myself drawing on the same skills I'd used when reporting Harold Vance. I documented specific observations, noted patterns of behavior, and trusted my instincts about what I was seeing. The investigation revealed that Marcus's stepfather had been abusing him and his younger sister, and the children were removed from the home before the situation could escalate further. Mrs. Patterson, the social worker told me during a follow-up call, your detailed observations and willingness to report your concerns probably saved those children from years of continued abuse. Too many teachers see signs but convince themselves they're overreacting or that it's not their place to get involved. That conversation reinforced something I'd learned from my experience with Harold Vance. The cost of being wrong about a dangerous situation is always less than the cost of being right but failing to act. It might be uncomfortable to make a report that turns out to be unfounded, but it's devastating to ignore warning signs that could have prevented further harm. Over the following months, I found myself becoming something of an unofficial resource for other teachers who were struggling with similar concerns about their students. My experience had given me a framework for thinking about how to document observations, when to trust instincts over concrete evidence, and how to navigate the emotional challenges of getting involved in potentially dangerous situations. Principal Johnson asked me to lead a professional development workshop on recognizing and reporting signs of child abuse and neglect. As I prepared for the presentation, I realized how many parallels there were between my experience with Harold Vance and the challenges teachers face in identifying children who are in danger at home. The signs are often subtle, I told my colleagues during the workshop. You're looking for patterns of behavior, changes in personality, and details that don't quite add up when you put them together. Just like with my neighbor, it's not usually one dramatic incident that alerts you to a problem. It's an accumulation of small things that create a picture of something being very wrong. I shared strategies for documenting observations objectively, for approaching sensitive conversations with children, and for managing the emotional toll of dealing with these situations. I also talked about the importance of following through on reports and staying involved in cases even when the initial response from authorities might seem inadequate. One of the most valuable lessons I could share came from Dr. Williams, my therapist, who had helped me understand the psychological dynamics that prevent people from acting on their suspicions. She called it the bystander effect, the tendency for people to assume that someone else will take responsibility for addressing a problem they have observed. When you see something concerning, I told the teachers, don't assume that someone else has already reported it, or that someone else will handle it. Children often interact with dozens of adults in their daily lives, but each of those adults might be thinking the same thing you are, that surely someone else has noticed and taken action. The result is that nobody acts, and the child continues to suffer. The workshop was so well received that I was invited to present at other schools in our district and eventually at state education conferences. Each time I shared my story, I met teachers who had similar experiences of noticing concerning signs but struggling with whether and how to respond. Many of them told me that hearing about my experience with Harold Vance had given them the courage to trust their instincts and make reports they might otherwise have dismissed as unfounded concerns. One particularly moving conversation happened after a presentation in a rural district about 2 hours from my school. A kindergarten teacher named Mrs. Foster approached me with tears in her eyes, explaining that she'd been worried about one of her students for weeks but hadn't known how to proceed. "Little Emma comes to school hungry almost every day," she said, "and she's always talking about the visitors who come to her house at night. She draws pictures of people doing things that no 5-year-old should know about, but when I ask her about it, she gets scared and won't say anything more. After hearing your presentation, I know I can't keep telling myself it's probably nothing." I spent an hour with Mrs. Foster, helping her organize her observations and plan her approach for making a report to Child Protective Services. 2 weeks later, she called to tell me that the investigation had uncovered a situation where Emma's mother was prostituting herself out of their home, often with Emma present in the house. The little girl was removed from the situation and placed with relatives who could provide her with safety and stability. "You were right," Mrs. Foster said. "It's better to be wrong about something like this than to be right and do nothing. Emma's life is completely different now, and it's because you gave me the tools and the courage to act on what I was seeing." These experiences reinforced my growing understanding that the skills I developed in recognizing and responding to the Harold Vance situation were applicable to many different types of dangerous circumstances. The ability to notice patterns, document observations objectively, trust instincts while still seeking concrete evidence, and persist in the face of bureaucratic obstacles or skeptical responses were valuable tools for protecting vulnerable people in all kinds of situations. My reputation as someone who was willing and able to handle these difficult situations led to my appointment to our school district's crisis intervention team. This group of teachers, counsellors and administrators was responsible for developing protocols for responding to various emergency situations, from natural disasters to active shooter scenarios to suspected child abuse cases. Working with the crisis team expanded my perspective on community safety beyond just the neighborhood level. I learned about the complex systems and procedures that schools use to identify and protect students who are in danger, and I gained a deeper appreciation for the challenges that educators face in balancing their duty to report suspected abuse with their need to maintain trusting relationships with students and families. One of the projects I worked on with the crisis team was developing a training program for substitute teachers and volunteer workers who might not have the same level of experience recognizing warning signs as full-time staff. These temporary workers often have unique opportunities to observe students and families, since they're not bound by the same long-term relationship dynamics that sometimes prevent regular teachers from seeing concerning patterns. Sometimes it takes fresh eyes to notice what regular staff have become accustomed to, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, the district's Director of Student Services. A substitute teacher might be the first person to realize that a child's frequent absences aren't due to illness, but to something more troubling happening at home. A volunteer might notice that a student is unusually fearful around certain adults or uncomfortable in certain situations. The training program we developed included modules on recognizing signs of abuse and neglect, understanding mandatory reporting requirements, and knowing how to document and report concerns appropriately. We also included information about trauma-informed teaching practices and strategies for supporting students who had experienced adverse childhood experiences. One aspect of the training that I found particularly important was helping participants understand the difference between being vigilant and being paranoid. My experience with Harold Vance had taught me that there's a fine line between healthy awareness and destructive obsession, and I wanted to make sure that the people we were training understood how to maintain that balance. Being alert to potential problems is important, I would tell the training participants, but you also need to be able to function normally and maintain positive relationships with the people around you. The goal is to notice genuine warning signs while still giving people the benefit of the doubt when there's no real reason for concern. This balance became particularly important as I continued to navigate my own recovery from the trauma of living next to Harold Vance. There were times when my heightened awareness of potential dangers became counterproductive, causing me to see threats where none existed or to become overly suspicious of normal behavior. I remember one incident about 18 months after Vance's arrest when I became convinced that the new janitor at our school was behaving inappropriately around female students. He would linger in hallways when classes were changing, and I noticed that he always seemed to find reasons to clean areas where teenage girls congregated. When I saw him having what appeared to be an overly friendly conversation with one of my former students, now in middle school, I immediately reported my concerns to the principal. The investigation revealed that the janitor was indeed acting inappropriately, making comments about students' appearances and trying to engage them in conversations that made them uncomfortable. He was terminated, and several students came forward to report interactions that had made them uneasy, but that they hadn't known how to address. However, I laterined sensitivity to potential threats. The janitor's behavior was learned that my initial observations had been colored by my own trauma and height, inappropriate and worthy of investigation, but it wasn't as sinister as I'd initially believed. He was a lonely older man who had poor social boundaries, not a predator with malicious intent. This experience taught me an important lesson about the need to separate my emotional response to potential threats from my objective assessment of actual danger. Dr. Williams helped me understand that trauma can sometimes cause people to overinterpret neutral situations as threatening, and she taught me techniques for grounding myself in facts rather than fears when evaluating concerning behavior. Your instincts are valuable, she explained, but they need to be balanced with rational analysis and input from other people who can provide perspective. The goal is to remain alert to genuine dangers without letting past trauma cause you to see threats everywhere you look. This insight became particularly important as I continued to speak at community events and safety workshops. I realized that my story could potentially inspire helpful vigilance in some people while triggering unhealthy paranoia in others, and I needed to be careful about how I presented the lessons I'd learned. I started including more information in my presentations about the importance of self-care and emotional balance when dealing with safety concerns. I would talk about the warning signs of becoming too consumed by worry about potential threats, and I would provide resources for people who found themselves struggling with anxiety or paranoia after learning about cases like Harold Vance's. It's possible to be appropriately cautious without being constantly afraid, I would tell audiences. The goal is to develop healthy awareness that enhances your safety and your community's well-being, not to become so focused on potential dangers that you can't enjoy your life or maintain normal relationships with the people around you.
This message seemed to resonate particularly strongly with parents, many of whom struggled with finding the right balance between protecting their children and allowing them the freedom to explore and grow. I received numerous emails from mothers and fathers who said that my presentation had helped them think more clearly about how to teach their children about safety without instilling unnecessary fear.
One letter that particularly moved me came from a single mother in Colorado whose teenage daughter had been reluctant to report a teacher who was making her uncomfortable because she didn't want to cause trouble or be seen as overreacting to innocent behavior. After we attended your presentation together, the mother wrote, my daughter felt empowered to trust her instincts and report the situation to the school counselor. It turned out that several other students had similar concerns about this teacher, and the investigation revealed a pattern of inappropriate behavior that had been going on for months. My daughter learned that speaking up about something that makes you uncomfortable isn't causing trouble, it's protecting yourself and others. Stories like this reinforced my belief that education and awareness could make a real difference in preventing crimes and protecting vulnerable people, but they also highlighted the ongoing challenge of helping people distinguish between genuine warning signs and normal variations in human behavior. As I continued to develop my expertise in this area, I began to collaborate with law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy organizations on developing educational materials and training programs. Detective Santos, who had remained a valuable mentor and resource, introduced me to other professionals who were working on similar initiatives in different parts of the country. Through these connections, I learned about research being conducted on the psychology of bystander intervention and the factors that influence whether people act on their suspicions about potentially dangerous situations. The findings were fascinating and directly relevant to the work I was doing in schools and communities. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a criminologist at the State University, shared research showing that people are more likely to report suspicious activity when they have clear guidelines about what constitutes reportable behavior, and when they feel confident that their reports will be taken seriously by authorities. She also found that communities with strong social networks and communication systems were more effective at identifying and addressing safety threats. Your experience with Harold Vance is actually a perfect case study in effective bystander intervention, Dr. Martinez told me during one of our conversations. You noticed concerning signs, you documented your observations, you sought advice from others, and you persisted in reporting your concerns even when the initial response wasn't entirely satisfactory. Those are exactly the behaviors we want to encourage in community safety programs. Her research also revealed some sobering statistics about how often people fail to act on their suspicions about dangerous situations. Studies showed that in cases involving domestic violence, child abuse, and other crimes that occur in residential settings, neighbors and community members often notice warning signs but fail to report them due to uncertainty, fear of retaliation, or assumptions that someone else will handle the situation. The tragedy, Dr. Martinez explained, is that in many of these cases, multiple people noticed concerning signs, but none of them acted on their observations. If even one person had been willing to make a report, the outcome might have been very different. This information motivated me to focus more of my educational efforts on addressing the psychological and practical barriers that prevent people from acting on their suspicions. I started including more specific guidance in my presentations about how to overcome common hesitations and how to make effective reports to appropriate authorities. I also began working with local law enforcement agencies to improve their responsiveness to community concerns and to provide better feedback to people who made reports about suspicious activity. One of the most valuable outcomes of this collaboration was the development of a community liaison program that assigned specific officers to serve as points of contact for neighborhood safety concerns. Officer Jennifer Park, who became our neighborhood liaison after the program launched, explained how the system was designed to address some of the communication problems that had made it difficult for people to report concerns effectively in the past. When someone calls the general police number with a vague concern about a neighbor, it's easy for that report to get lost in the shuffle or to be treated as a low priority, she said. But when they call me directly, I know the neighborhood, I know the history of previous reports, and I can follow up appropriately, even if the initial concern doesn't seem to warrant immediate investigation. Officer Park also made regular visits to community meetings and neighborhood events, building relationships with residents and educating them about what types of activities they should report and how to make reports most effectively. Her presence in the community created a sense of partnership between residents and law enforcement that made people more willing to share concerns and more confident that their reports would be handled appropriately. The success of our neighborhood liaison program attracted attention from other communities and law enforcement agencies across the region. I was invited to speak at several conferences and workshops about the role that citizen reporting had played in uncovering Harold Vance's crimes and how communities could develop systems to encourage and support this type of civic engagement. One particularly memorable presentation was at a national conference on community policing, where I shared the stage with Detective Santos and Officer Park to discuss the Vance case as an example of effective collaboration between citizens and law enforcement. The audience included police chiefs, community organizers, and public safety officials from across the country, and the questions they asked revealed both the widespread nature of the challenges we were addressing and the genuine interest in finding solutions. What would you say to someone who's noticed something concerning but is afraid to report it because they're worried about being wrong? Asked a police chief from Oregon. I would tell them that the cost of being wrong about a dangerous situation is much less than the cost of being right and doing nothing, I replied, drawing on the lesson I'd learned from my therapist and my own experience. It's better to make a report that turns out to be unfounded than to stay silent about something that could prevent harm to innocent people. A community organizer from Texas asked about the emotional toll of being involved in these types of situations and how people could maintain their well-being while still being vigilant about safety concerns. This question gave me an opportunity to talk about the importance of self-care and professional support for people who take on the responsibility of watching out for their communities. You can't pour from an empty cup, I told the audience. If you're going to be effective at protecting others, you need to take care of yourself first. That means setting boundaries, seeking support when you need it, and recognizing when your vigilance is becoming unhealthy obsession.
The conference presentation led to several opportunities to consult with other communities that were trying to develop their own citizen reporting programs and neighborhood safety initiatives. Each of these projects taught me something new about the challenges and opportunities involved in building effective partnerships between residents and law enforcement.
In a small town in Montana, I worked with local officials to address concerns about drug activity in residential neighborhoods. The community had been struggling with methamphetamine production and distribution, but residents were reluctant to report suspicious activity because they feared retaliation from drug dealers and because previous reports had not resulted in visible action by authorities. The solution involved creating an anonymous reporting system that allowed residents to share concerns without revealing their identities, combined with a commitment from law enforcement to provide regular updates to the community about investigations and enforcement activities. Within 6 months, the number of reports increased dramatically, and several major drug operations were shut down based on information provided by concerned citizens. In an urban neighborhood in Pennsylvania, I helped develop a training program for residents of a housing complex where domestic violence and child abuse were persistent problems. Many residents were immigrants who were afraid to interact with police due to concerns about their legal status, while others had cultural backgrounds that discouraged involving outsiders in family disputes. The program focused on building trust between residents and social service agencies, providing education about legal protections for immigrants who reported crimes, and creating support systems for people who were willing to speak up about dangerous situations they observed. The results were encouraging, with significant increases in reports of domestic violence and child abuse, and corresponding improvements in the safety and well-being of vulnerable residents. These experiences expanded my understanding of the complex factors that influence whether people act on their concerns about potentially dangerous situations. I learned that effective community safety programs need to address not just the practical aspects of identifying and reporting threats, but also the cultural, economic, and psychological barriers that prevent people from getting involved. As I continued this work, I also began to see how the lessons I'd learned from my experience with Harold Vance were relevant to other types of community challenges beyond violent crime. The same skills that had helped me recognize and respond to signs of dangerous criminal activity could be applied to identifying and addressing problems like environmental hazards, public health threats, and infrastructure failures. For example, when several residents in a neighboring community became ill with similar symptoms over the course of a few weeks, it was a retired teacher who noticed the pattern and reported it to health authorities. Her willingness to pay attention to what seemed like unrelated coincidences led to the discovery that a local factory was illegally dumping toxic chemicals that were contaminating the groundwater supply. Similarly, when a bridge in our county developed structural problems that could have led to a catastrophic collapse, it was discovered because a mail carrier noticed that the concrete was cracking and reported his observations to transportation officials. His attention to detail and willingness to speak up potentially saved hundreds of lives and prevented millions of dollars in damage. These examples reinforce my belief that the principles of effective community vigilance could be applied broadly to protect public safety and well-being in many different contexts. The key elements were the same: paying attention to patterns and changes in the environment, trusting instincts about when something doesn't seem right, documenting observations objectively, and persisting in reporting concerns even when the initial response might be skeptical or inadequate. As I write this, nearly 4 years have passed since that first morning, when I noticed the strange smell coming from Harold Vance's property. The lessons I learned from that experience continue to shape my work as an educator, my involvement in community safety initiatives, and my understanding of what it means to be a responsible citizen and neighbor. The house next door has been completed for over a year now, and David and Linda's family has become an integral part of our neighborhood community. Their children play in the yard where Harold Vance once buried his victims, but that space has been transformed into something life-affirming and joyful. The swing set and sandbox that occupy the spot where I once found scattered bones serve as a powerful reminder that healing and renewal are possible even in places touched by the darkest evil. The Community Watch program we established in the aftermath of Vance's crimes has evolved into something much broader than just a safety initiative. We've organised block parties, holiday celebrations, and volunteer projects that have brought neighbours together in ways that go far beyond our shared concern about crime prevention. The connections we've built with each other have created a network of mutual support that enhances our quality of life in countless ways. But, perhaps most importantly, we've learned to see ourselves as active participants in our community's safety and well-being, rather than passive residents who hope that someone else will handle problems when they arise. We've learned that ordinary people have extraordinary power to protect each other and to prevent tragedies through simple acts of attention, courage, and civic engagement.
The smell that first alerted me to Harold Vance's crimes is long gone, replaced by the fresh scents of Linda's flower garden and the aroma of barbecue from neighbourhood gatherings. But the memory of that smell continues to serve as a reminder of the importance of paying attention to our surroundings, trusting our instincts about when something doesn't seem right, and being willing to act on our concerns, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient.
I still receive letters and emails from people who have heard my story and been inspired to report suspicious activity in their own communities. Each success story reinforces my belief that education and awareness can make a real difference in preventing crimes and protecting vulnerable people. But I'm also mindful of the ongoing need to balance vigilance with wisdom, caution with compassion, and community safety with individual privacy and dignity. The experience of living next to a serial killer taught me that evil can hide behind the most mundane appearances, and that the difference between tragedy and prevention sometimes comes down to whether someone cares enough to pay attention and speak up. But it also taught me about the power of community, the importance of supporting each other through difficult times, and the possibility of creating something positive and healing even in the aftermath of unthinkable horror. As I look out my kitchen window at the house where David and Linda's children are now playing safely in their backyard, I'm reminded that the most important legacy of Harold Vance's crimes isn't the fear and trauma they caused, but the stronger, more connected community that emerged from our shared determination to protect each other and prevent such horrors from happening again. The smell may be gone, but the lessons it taught us remain. And in a world where evil sometimes hides in plain sight, those lessons may be the most valuable gift we can give to future generations of neighbours, teachers, parents and citizens who understand that protecting each other is not just someone else's responsibility, but our own.
The ripple effects of the Harold Vance case extended into areas of my life I never could have anticipated. About 6 months after his sentencing, I received a phone call that would open an entirely new chapter in my journey of understanding how communities can protect themselves from predators hiding in plain sight.
The caller was Dr. Rebecca Sterling, a forensic psychologist who worked with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. She'd been following the media coverage of the case and was particularly interested in the role that community observation had played in uncovering Vance's crimes. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to participate in a research study examining how ordinary citizens can be trained to recognize warning signs of serial predatory behavior. What makes your case so valuable from a research perspective, Dr. Sterling explained during our initial conversation, is that you weren't a law enforcement professional or someone with specialized training in criminal behavior. You were just a regular person who noticed that something wasn't right and had the courage to investigate further. We want to understand what factors enabled you to see what others might have missed and how we can help other communities develop similar capabilities. The research project involved extensive interviews about my background, personality traits, observational skills, and decision-making processes during the weeks leading up to Vance's arrest. Dr. Sterling and her team were particularly interested in understanding what had motivated me to persist in my investigation despite the lack of immediate validation from authorities and the potential risks involved in getting involved. Most people experience what we call diffusion of responsibility, she explained. When they notice something concerning, they assume that someone else has probably noticed it too, and that someone else will take action. What's unusual about your response is that you took personal ownership of the problem and continued to gather information and seek help, even when the initial responses were discouraging. The psychological assessment process was fascinating and sometimes uncomfortable, requiring me to examine aspects of my personality and life experiences that I'd never considered particularly relevant to what had happened with Harold Vance. The researchers were interested in everything from my childhood experiences with authority figures to my professional training as a teacher to my personal history of dealing with conflict and uncertainty. One of the most revealing exercises involved reviewing detailed timelines of my observations and actions, analyzing the decision points where I could have chosen to disengage from the situation or dismiss my concerns as unfounded. Dr. Sterling helped me understand that there had been multiple opportunities for me to convince myself that I was overreacting or that the situation wasn't my responsibility to address. At each of these decision points, she noted, you chose to continue investigating rather than backing away. That pattern of persistence is actually quite rare in civilian populations. Most people would have stopped after the first few discouraging responses from authorities, or after realizing that getting involved might put them at personal risk. The research team was also interested in the environmental and social factors that had contributed to my ability to detect Vance's activities. They noted that my house's location and orientation had given me a unique vantage point for observing his property, but they also pointed out that other neighbors had similar opportunities to notice concerning signs and had failed to do so. Physical proximity alone doesn't explain why you noticed the patterns while others didn't, Dr. Sterling observed. There seemed to be cognitive and behavioral factors that made you more likely to pay attention to subtle environmental changes and to interpret them as potentially significant. Through a series of tests and exercises, the researchers identified several characteristics that they believed had contributed to my effectiveness as an unintentional community sentinel. I scored high on measures of environmental awareness and pattern recognition, traits that were probably enhanced by my work as an elementary school teacher, where success depends on noticing subtle changes in children's behavior and emotional states. I also demonstrated what they called constructive paranoia, a tendency to consider multiple explanations for unusual observations while maintaining enough skepticism to seek additional evidence rather than jumping to conclusions. This balance between openness to concerning possibilities and commitment to fact-gathering seemed to be crucial for effective threat detection. Perhaps most importantly, the assessment revealed that I had a strong sense of personal agency and civic responsibility, combined with relatively low levels of social anxiety about challenging authority figures or reporting concerns that might be unwelcome. many people notice concerning signs but fail to act because they're afraid of being seen as troublemakers or because they lack confidence in their ability to navigate complex reporting systems. The findings from my case, combined with similar research involving other civilian witnesses in criminal cases, contributed to the development of training programs designed to enhance community-based threat detection capabilities. These programs focused on teaching people how to recognize patterns of suspicious behavior, how to document observations effectively, and how to persist in reporting concerns through appropriate channels. Dr. Sterling invited me to participate in the pilot testing of these training programs, which were implemented in several communities across the country that had requested assistance with public safety challenges. The programs were tailored to address specific local concerns, from domestic violence and child abuse to drug trafficking and terrorism, but they all shared common elements based on the lessons learned from cases like mine. One of the most successful implementations was in a college town in North Carolina that had been struggling with a series of sexual assaults targeting female students. Despite increased security measures and awareness campaigns, the attacks continued, and authorities were having difficulty identifying patterns that might help them predict where the perpetrator would strike next. The community training program focused on teaching students, faculty, and residents how to recognize and report suspicious behavior that might indicate predatory activity. Participants learned about the grooming behaviors that sexual predators often exhibit, the environmental factors that make certain locations attractive to criminals, and the importance of reporting concerns even when they might seem minor or unrelated to criminal activity. Within 3 months of implementing the program, reports of suspicious activity increased by over 300%. More importantly, the quality of the reports improved dramatically, with community members providing detailed, objective observations that helped law enforcement identify patterns and develop effective prevention strategies. The program culminated in the arrest of the serial attacker, who was caught based on information provided by a graduate student who had been trained to recognize the behavioral patterns associated with predatory stalking. The transformation in this community has been remarkable, said Detective Lisa Wong, who coordinated the law enforcement response to the training program. Before the program, we were getting maybe 1 or 2 reports per month of suspicious activity, and most of those were too vague to be actionable. Now we're getting dozens of detailed reports that provide us with the information we need to identify threats and protect potential victims. The success of programs like this one led to expanded funding for community-based threat detection initiatives, and I found myself increasingly involved in developing and implementing these efforts across different types of communities. Each project taught me something new about the challenges and opportunities involved in mobilizing ordinary citizens to protect each other from various types of predatory behavior. In a rural farming community in Iowa, we developed a program focused on recognizing signs of human trafficking, an issue that many residents hadn't realized was affecting their area. The isolated location and limited law enforcement presence made these communities particularly vulnerable to criminals who used remote properties for trafficking operations. But the tight-knit nature of rural communities also made them potentially very effective at detecting and reporting suspicious activity. The training focused on helping residents recognize signs that properties might be being used for trafficking, such as unusual patterns of vehicle traffic, evidence of people being held against their will, and behavioral indicators that suggested exploitation. We also provided guidance on how to report concerns to appropriate federal agencies, since human trafficking cases often involve multiple jurisdictions and specialized investigative units. The program's effectiveness was demonstrated when a farmer noticed that a neighboring property had started receiving frequent visits from vehicles with out-of-state license plates, always at night and always for very brief periods. The visitors never seemed to be carrying goods or equipment that would suggest legitimate business activity, and the farmer occasionally heard sounds that suggested there were more people on the property than the number of cars in the driveway would indicate. Based on his training, the farmer documented his observations over several weeks and reported his concerns to the FBI tip line. The subsequent investigation revealed a sophisticated trafficking operation that was using the rural property as a way station for moving victims between major metropolitan areas. The operation was shut down, and 17 victims were rescued and provided with services to help them recover from their ordeal. Without that farmer's willingness to pay attention and report what he was seeing, said Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, who led the investigation, we might never have discovered this operation. The victims were being moved regularly, and the criminals were very good at avoiding detection by traditional surveillance methods. It took someone who knew the normal patterns of activity in that area to recognize that something unusual was happening. These successes reinforced my growing understanding that effective community protection requires more than just individual vigilance. It requires systems and networks that enable people to share information, coordinate responses, and support each other through the challenges of dealing with potentially dangerous situations. The most successful programs were those that created ongoing relationships between community members and law enforcement, rather than simply providing one-time training sessions. This insight led to my involvement in developing what we called Community Sentinel Networks, ongoing partnerships between residents, local businesses, schools, and law enforcement agencies that were designed to enhance collective situational awareness and response capabilities. These networks went beyond traditional neighborhood watch programs by incorporating systematic training, regular communication protocols, and coordinated response plans for different types of threats. The first comprehensive community sentinel network was established in a mid-sized city in Arizona that had been experiencing increases in several different types of criminal activity, from drug trafficking to child exploitation to domestic terrorism. Rather than addressing each threat separately, city officials decided to develop an integrated approach that would enhance the community's overall capacity to detect and respond to various types of dangerous activity. The network included representatives from residential neighborhoods, business districts, schools, healthcare facilities, and social service organizations. Each sector received specialized training relevant to the types of threats they were most likely to encounter, but all participants also received general education about threat recognition, reporting procedures, and coordination with law enforcement responses. The residential component focused on helping neighbors recognize signs of criminal activity in their communities, from drug houses and illegal weapon storage to domestic violence and child abuse. Business participants learned about indicators of money laundering, human trafficking, and terrorism financing, while school personnel received enhanced training on recognizing signs of abuse, exploitation, and radicalization among students. Healthcare workers learned about their unique opportunities to identify victims of trafficking, domestic violence, and other crimes who might seek medical treatment but be reluctant to report their situations directly to law enforcement. Social service providers received training on recognizing signs that their clients might be involved in or threatened by criminal activity that could affect community safety. What made the network particularly effective was the coordination component that enabled different sectors to share relevant information and coordinate responses to complex situations that might involve multiple types of criminal activity. For example, when school personnel noticed signs that a student might be being exploited, they could quickly connect with healthcare and social service providers who could assess the situation and provide appropriate interventions, while also alerting law enforcement if criminal activity was suspected. The network's effectiveness was demonstrated repeatedly during its first year of operation. In one case, a combination of reports from residential participants who noticed unusual traffic patterns, business owners who observed suspicious financial transactions, and school personnel who were concerned about changes in a student's behavior led to the discovery of a family-based drug trafficking operation that was using children as couriers and money launderers. In another case, healthcare workers who noticed patterns in the injuries and behavior of several patients were able to connect with social service providers and law enforcement to uncover a domestic violence situation that had escalated to involve threats against multiple family members and community members who had tried to help the victims. The network approach allows us to see patterns and connections that might not be visible to any single participant, explained Chief Patricia Harrison, who oversaw law enforcement coordination with the network. When you have trained observers throughout the community who are communicating with each other and with us, you can identify complex criminal operations much more quickly and effectively than traditional investigative methods alone would allow. The success of the Arizona network led to requests for similar programs from communities across the country, and I found myself traveling extensively to help other cities and regions develop their own community sentinel networks. Each implementation required careful adaptation to local conditions, cultural factors, and specific threat environments, but the core principles remained consistent: systematic training, ongoing communication, coordinated response, and sustained partnership between community members and professional public safety agencies. One of the most challenging implementations was in an urban area with significant economic inequality and historical tensions between residents and law enforcement. Many community members were reluctant to participate in programs that involved cooperation with police, either because of negative past experiences or because of concerns about the potential consequences of increased law enforcement attention in their neighborhoods. The solution required extensive community engagement and trust-building activities before any training or network development could begin. We worked with local community organizations, religious leaders, and social justice advocates to develop an approach that addressed residents' concerns while still providing effective public safety benefits. The modified program placed greater emphasis on community-controlled responses to non-criminal safety concerns, with law enforcement involvement limited to situations that clearly required professional intervention. Participants received training on how to address issues like domestic disputes, mental health crises, and youth conflicts through community-based mediation and support services, with police involvement reserved for situations involving serious violence or other criminal activity. This approach proved to be highly effective, not only in enhancing community safety, but also in improving relationships between residents and law enforcement agencies. Community cohesion and collective efficacy increased as residents became Crime rates in participating neighborhoods decreased significantly, but equally importantly more skilled at supporting each other and addressing problems collaboratively. The network gave us tools and connections that we never had before, said Maria Santos, a community organizer who participated in the program development. Instead of feeling helpless when we noticed problems in our neighborhood, we now have ways to address them that don't necessarily involve calling the police, but that also don't require us to ignore serious safety threats. The success of these varied implementations led to recognition from federal agencies and national organizations working on community safety and crime prevention. I was invited to present at conferences, participate in policy discussions, and contribute to the development of best practice guidelines for community-based threat detection and response programs. One of the most meaningful recognition events was a ceremony at the Department of Justice, where community members who had played crucial roles in preventing or solving serious crimes were honored for their contributions to public safety. Standing on the stage with other ordinary citizens who had made extraordinary differences in their community's safety and well-being was both humbling and inspiring. During the ceremony, Attorney General Patricia Williams spoke about the critical role that community engagement plays in preventing crime and protecting vulnerable populations. She specifically mentioned the Harold Vance case as an example of how citizen vigilance and persistence can uncover serious threats that might otherwise go undetected by traditional law enforcement methods. The men and women we're honoring today represent the best of American civic engagement, she said. They remind us that public safety is not just the responsibility of professional law enforcement officers, but the shared responsibility of all citizens who care about protecting their communities and supporting each other. After the ceremony, I had the opportunity to meet with other honorees and learn about their experiences with community-based crime prevention and victim protection. Their stories reinforced many of the lessons I'd learned from my own experience, particularly the importance of trusting instincts, persisting despite initial skepticism from authorities, and building networks of support that can sustain long-term engagement with public safety challenges. One conversation that particularly resonated with me was with a woman named Jennifer Walsh, whose persistence in reporting concerns about a neighbor had led to the rescue of 3 children who were being held captive and abused. Like me, she had initially been dismissed by authorities who thought her concerns were unfounded, but she had continued to document observations and seek help until someone finally took action. The hardest part wasn't noticing that something was wrong, Jennifer told me. It was convincing other people to take it seriously and finding the courage to keep pushing when everyone seemed to think I was overreacting. But I knew those children were in danger, and I couldn't live with myself if I gave up and something terrible happened to them. Her experience highlighted something I had learned from my work with Dr. Sterling and the research team. Effective community protection requires not just individual courage and persistence, but also systems and cultures that support and validate people who are willing to report concerns about potentially dangerous situations. This insight became central to the next phase of my work, which focused on developing institutional policies and procedures that could make it easier for people to report concerns and, more likely, that those reports would be taken seriously and investigated appropriately. I worked with schools, businesses, healthcare organizations, and government agencies to review their reporting systems and develop improvements that could enhance their responsiveness to community safety concerns. One of the most impactful projects was with a large hospital system that was struggling to identify and respond appropriately to patients who were victims of trafficking, domestic violence, and other crimes. Healthcare workers were often in positions to observe signs of victimization, but they lacked clear protocols for documenting concerns, reporting to appropriate agencies, and coordinating with law enforcement and social services. Working with the hospital's social work department, legal team, and security personnel, we developed comprehensive training programs and reporting procedures that enabled healthcare workers to fulfill their professional obligations while also contributing to broader community safety efforts. The program included guidance on recognizing signs of various types of victimization, documenting observations in ways that could support both medical treatment and potential legal proceedings, and coordinating with external agencies to ensure that victims received appropriate services and protection. The program's effectiveness was demonstrated when emergency room staff began identifying significantly more victims of trafficking and domestic violence, leading to increased prosecutions of perpetrators and enhanced services for victims. More broadly, the hospital became a more effective partner in community safety efforts, providing valuable information and resources that helped law enforcement agencies address complex criminal operations. The training gave our staff the knowledge and confidence they needed to act on their professional instincts, said Dr. Michael Chen, the hospital's chief medical officer. Before the program, nurses and doctors would sometimes notice signs that patients might be victims of violence or exploitation, but they weren't sure how to respond appropriately. Now they have clear protocols and support systems that enable them to help patients while also contributing to broader public safety efforts. Similar projects with schools, businesses, and other organizations produced comparable results, demonstrating that institutional support for community-based threat detection could significantly enhance overall public safety while also protecting individuals who might be at risk. These successes led to the development of policy recommendations that were adopted by several state governments and incorporated into federal guidelines for community policing and crime prevention programs. As this work expanded, I found myself reflecting on how far I had come from that first morning when I simply noticed a strange smell coming from my neighbor's property. What had started as an individual response to a specific local threat had evolved into a comprehensive approach to community safety that was being implemented across the country and influencing policy at the highest levels of government. Yet the core lessons remained the same: the importance of paying attention to our surroundings, trusting our instincts about when something doesn't seem right, documenting observations objectively, and persisting in reporting concerns even when initial responses might be discouraging. These simple principles, applied systematically and supported by appropriate training and institutional systems, could make extraordinary differences in protecting vulnerable people and preventing serious crimes. The smell that had first alerted me to Harold Vance's activities was long gone, but the awareness it had awakened continued to guide my work and my understanding of what it means to be a responsible member of a community. I had learned that ordinary people have extraordinary power to protect each other, but only when they're willing to pay attention, speak up, and persist in the face of obstacles and skepticism. As I continued to travel and speak about these issues, I carried with me the knowledge that somewhere in communities across the country, people were applying these lessons to protect their neighbors, their families, and their communities from threats that might otherwise go undetected. That knowledge gave meaning to the trauma I had experienced and hope for the possibility that other Harold Vances might be stopped before they could claim more victims. The house next door continued to thrive with new life, but the lessons learned from its dark past remained as relevant as ever. In a world where evil sometimes hides behind ordinary facades, those lessons represented our best hope for protecting each other and building communities where safety and well-being are truly shared responsibilities. The work I was doing with communities across the country eventually led to an invitation that would challenge everything I thought I knew about predatory behavior and community safety. Dr. James Whitfield, a criminologist at the University of Virginia, contacted me about participating in a unique research project that was examining what he called predator clusters, geographical areas where multiple offenders seem to operate simultaneously or in sequence, often without any apparent connection to each other. What we're finding, Dr. Whitfield explained during our initial phone conversation, is that certain communities seem to attract or produce serial offenders at rates that far exceed statistical probability. We think there might be environmental, social, or psychological factors that create conditions favorable to predatory behavior, and we're hoping that people like you, who have direct experience with these situations, might help us understand what those factors are. The research involved traveling to communities that had experienced multiple serious crimes involving predatory behavior over relatively short periods of time. My role was to spend time in these areas, observing the physical and social environments, interviewing residents and law enforcement personnel, and trying to identify patterns that might explain why these locations seem to be magnets for dangerous individuals. The first site I visited was a small town in Montana that had experienced 3 separate cases of child abduction over a 5-year period, all involving different perpetrators who had no known connections to each other. The town had a population of fewer than 8,000 people, making the concentration of these crimes statistically almost impossible to explain as coincidence. Walking through the downtown area and residential neighborhoods, I was struck by how similar the environment was to my own community before Harold Vance's crimes were discovered. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained houses, children playing in yards while their parents worked in gardens or washed cars in driveways. It was exactly the kind of place where people moved to escape urban crime and raise their families in safety. But as I spent more time there and talked with residents, I began to notice subtle patterns that reminded me of the conditions that had enabled Vance to operate undetected for so long. The community was characterized by what sociologists call social fragmentation. People lived near each other but didn't really know each other well enough to notice when something was out of place. "Everyone keeps to themselves here," explained Janet Morrison, a local teacher who had lived in the town for over 20 years. "People are polite and friendly when you see them at the grocery store or the gas station, but we don't really have the kind of relationships where you'd notice if someone's routine changed or if there was something odd happening at their house." This social distance, combined with the town's physical layout, created what Dr. Whitfield called surveillance gaps, areas where suspicious activity could occur without being observed or reported by community members. Many of the houses sat on large lots with significant distances between neighbors, and the town's rural setting meant that unusual sounds or smells might not be noticed or might be attributed to farming activities or wildlife. The 3 child abduction cases had all involved perpetrators who had been able to establish themselves in the community without attracting attention or suspicion. They had rented houses in quiet neighborhoods, maintained normal-appearing daily routines, and built superficial relationships with neighbors that provided cover for their criminal activities without creating the deeper connections that might have exposed inconsistencies in their stories or behavior. Each of these guys was able to blend in because nobody was really paying close attention to anyone else, said Detective Ray Sullivan, who had worked all 3 cases. They looked normal, they acted normal in public, and they were smart enough not to do anything that would draw attention from the few people who might have been watching. The investigation into these cases had revealed that all 3 perpetrators had specifically chosen the town because of its reputation as a safe, quiet community where people minded their own business. They had researched the area online looking for places with low crime rates, limited law enforcement presence, and social characteristics that would make it easy for them to operate without detection. This revelation was deeply disturbing because it suggested that the very qualities that make communities attractive to families seeking safety might also make them attractive to predators seeking opportunities to commit crimes without being caught. The challenge was figuring out how to maintain the positive aspects of community life while developing the awareness and connectivity needed to detect and deter predatory behavior. Working with Dr. Whitfield and local officials, I helped develop a community assessment tool that could identify risk factors for predatory activity and recommend interventions to address those vulnerabilities. The assessment examined factors like population density, social connectivity, law enforcement resources, reporting systems, and community engagement levels to create profiles that could guide prevention efforts. The tool was tested in several communities that had requested assistance with safety concerns, and the results were encouraging. Communities that implemented the recommended interventions showed significant improvements in their ability to detect and respond to suspicious activity, while also maintaining the quality of life characteristics that made them desirable places to live. One of the most successful implementations was in a suburb of Denver that had been experiencing a series of home invasions targeting elderly residents. The assessment revealed that the community's demographics and physical layout created ideal conditions for this type of predatory behavior, but it also identified specific interventions that could reduce the risk without compromising residents' privacy or independence. The interventions included enhanced lighting in common areas, improved communication systems for reporting concerns, regular social activities that increased opportunities for neighbors to get to know each other, and partnerships with local businesses to create additional surveillance and reporting opportunities. Within 6 months of implementation, the home invasion stopped, and residents reported feeling significantly safer and more connected to their community. These successes led to broader interest in the community assessment approach, and I found myself working with urban planners, public safety officials, and community development organizations to integrate crime prevention principles into neighborhood design and social programming efforts. The work was challenging but rewarding, offering the possibility of preventing crimes before they occurred, rather than simply responding after victims had already been harmed. One of the most innovative projects involved working with a new residential development in North Carolina that was being designed from the ground up with community safety principles in mind. The developers wanted to create a neighborhood that would be attractive to families while also incorporating features that would deter criminal activity and enhance residents' ability to look out for each other. The design process involved extensive consultation with criminologists, law enforcement experts, and community safety advocates to develop a layout that maximized natural surveillance opportunities, minimized hiding places for potential predators, and created physical spaces that encouraged positive social interactions among residents. The result was a neighborhood that looked beautiful and welcoming, while also being inherently resistant to various types of criminal activity. The houses were positioned to provide clear sight lines between properties, with front porches and large windows that enabled residents to observe street activity naturally as part of their daily routines. Common areas like playgrounds and walking paths were located in highly visible locations and designed to accommodate multiple users simultaneously, reducing opportunities for predators to isolate potential victims. The community also incorporated technological features that enhanced safety without creating an oppressive atmosphere. Discrete security cameras were integrated into streetlights and common areas, and residents were provided with smartphone apps that enabled them to report concerns quickly and receive updates about safety issues in real time. Most importantly, the development included a comprehensive orientation program for new residents that educated them about community safety principles, introduced them to their neighbors, and connected them with ongoing activities and communication systems that maintained social connectivity over time. We wanted to create a community where people naturally look out for each other because they know each other and care about each other's well-being, explained Sarah Martinez, the lead developer. The physical design supports that goal, but the real safety comes from the relationships and communication systems that help residents stay aware of what's happening in their neighborhood. The project attracted national attention from urban planning and public safety professionals, and similar principles began to be incorporated into other residential developments across the country. The success of these efforts demonstrated that it was possible to design communities that were inherently resistant to predatory behavior while still maintaining the privacy, beauty, and quality of life that residents desired. My involvement in these projects reinforced lessons I had learned from my experience with Harold Vance, but it also expanded my understanding of how community safety could be enhanced through proactive planning and design rather than simply reactive responses to crimes after they occurred. The most effective approaches combined physical environmental modifications with social programming and institutional support systems that enabled residents to protect each other effectively. As this work continued to evolve, I began to see connections between community safety principles and broader issues of social resilience and collective well-being. Communities that were effective at preventing and responding to criminal activity were often also more successful at addressing other challenges like natural disasters, economic disruption, and public health emergencies. That brings us to the end of tonight's terrifying journey into the darkness that can hide behind suburban normalcy. The smell that first alerted our storyteller to Harold Vance's horrific crimes may be gone, but the lessons learned from that experience continue to ripple outward, protecting communities and saving lives across the country. What started as one woman's decision to trust her instincts about a strange odor has become a testament to the extraordinary power that ordinary people possess to protect each other. It reminds us that sometimes the difference between tragedy and justice comes down to whether someone cares enough to pay attention, speak up, and refuse to look the other way when something doesn't feel right. The most chilling aspect of this story isn't just the horrific nature of Vance's crimes, but how easily they could have continued indefinitely if not for one neighbor's willingness to investigate what everyone else might have dismissed as nothing. How many Harold Vances are still out there, hiding behind the facade of suburban respectability, counting on our tendency to mind our own business and assume someone else will handle whatever seems wrong?
If you take anything away from tonight's story, let it be this. Your instincts matter, your observations have value, and your willingness to act on concerns could quite literally mean the difference between life and death for someone in your community.
I want to hear about your own experiences with suspicious neighbors or strange situations that made you question what was really happening behind closed doors. Share your stories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying true accounts that will make you think twice about the people living right next door. Until next time, stay alert, trust your instincts, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who look just like everyone else.